Sugar in the 17th century was a treasure, a substance traded like jewels and locked away as if it were a weapon. Across Europe, nobles used it to mark their wealth, sculpting feasts of white crystals and syrup towers that spoke of power more than hunger. Yet inside a quiet house on the edge of the countryside, a family carried a rule that set them apart. They did not allow sugar to touch their lips. They dressed in plain cloth, spoke softly at the dinner table, and prayed before sleep with the air of saints. But their purity was not kindness. It was a cage. What appeared as discipline to neighbors was, in truth, the groundwork for something darker, something the world was not meant to see. The patriarch of the family, a man respected in sermons for his restraint, declared sugar to be poison to the soul. He spoke with the calm certainty of a doctor or priest, though he was neither. His logic was twisted, a blend of scripture and borrowed fragments of medical warnings, reshaped to fit his own purpose. He told his children that sugar bred corruption, that sweetness on the tongue would rot the heart, and that every bite carried sin. To outsiders, these words might have sounded like strict morality, but inside the house they were law, and laws carried punishments that no one dared to describe aloud. The children grew up in silence, watching visitors from afar lick honey from their fingers or pour molasses into bread. They did not cry for such things, for they had been taught early that even a wish was dangerous. At night, when hunger gnawed and dreams tempted them with visions of candied fruit, they awoke in terror, believing their father could hear the beating of their guilty hearts. To want was to betray him, and betrayal in that house did not end with scolding. It ended with lessons carved into flesh and memory. It was in this silence that one daughter broke. She was not the youngest, but she was the most curious. On a market day, while the family walked with hands folded and eyes lowered, she saw a servant drop a small crystal, a mere fragment of sugar once bound for a noble's feast. It landed in the dirt, glistening despite the dust, and she bent to pick it up. No one saw her slip it into her palm. No one saw her tuck it against her tongue. The sweetness was faint, gone almost before it was tasted, but it was enough to open a door inside her mind. It was not joy she felt, but terror, for she knew at once that she had crossed into forbidden ground. For days she carried the guilt, her body trembling at night as though waiting for discovery. The family lived in such unnatural closeness that every movement was watched, every swallow heard. She tried to hide it, but guilt is louder than footsteps, and the patriarch noticed. He noticed the way her eyes avoided his, the way her hands fidgeted in prayer. He did not accuse her at once, for he was a man who valued ritual above impulse. He let her fear ripen, let it curdle in her stomach until she could barely eat. Only when her silence grew heavy enough to crush her did he speak, asking in his calm, low voice if she had allowed herself to taste what was forbidden. She froze, unable to answer. That was all he needed. Punishment was not given in anger, but in method. The father believed every act of cruelty must carry meaning, must leave behind proof that desire itself was dangerous. He told the family that one disobedience threatened them all, that corruption spread like a stain. So he prepared a ritual. He brought her to the table where they ate in silence, laying her across it as though she were both sinner and sacrifice. He pressed sugar crystals against her gums, forcing them deep until her mouth bled. He made her chew until the sharpness cut her tongue, each movement tearing the inside of her lips. To him, this was not brutality but medicine, the only cure for sweetness. The others watched in silence, too terrified to speak, too conditioned to believe there might be a lesson for them in her suffering. The sound of her choking mixed with prayer whispered by their mother, who sat rigid, her hands clasped as though begging heaven to sanctify the act. The girl's cries grew weaker, her body trembling as blood stained her chin. When it ended, she was carried away, her absence explained as though she had gone to serve relatives in another town. But none of the children believed it. They had seen enough to know she was not coming back. From that night forward, every child carried the taste of iron in their mouths, as though their sister's blood had been pressed into them. The house returned to silence, yet beneath it grew something heavier, a dread that bound them tighter than prayer ever could. The rule had been broken, and in breaking it, the father's true nature had been revealed. He was not only a man of faith or discipline, he was something else entirely. A keeper of rituals, a collector of suffering, a man whose hunger was not for sugar but for control. The sweetness that had tempted one child now lay in memory as bitterness for them all, a warning of what their lives would become. And though the daughter was gone, her punishment lingered in the air like smoke that seeps into wood. It was only the beginning. The man who ruled the family was not a brute in the way the world usually recognized. He did not shout, nor raise his hand without reason. Instead, he dressed in plain black coats, spoke softly, and held his head with the calm posture of a man who believed himself chosen by God. Neighbors called him righteous, ministers called him disciplined. In truth, he was neither. He was something far colder, something that lived beneath the mask of faith, a mind that craved total order, and a heart that pulsed not with love but with the satisfaction of control. The patriarch studied words the way others studied scripture. He carried with him lines from clergymen who called sugar the devil's dust, and passages from physicians like Thomas Willis who warned of sweet things disturbing the balance of the body. But where others saw suggestion, he saw law. He stitched together sermons and medical notes into his own doctrine, claiming sugar was the root of sin, the door to corruption, the spark that burned flesh and spirit alike. His voice was calm as he repeated these teachings to his children, his wife, even to the servants who barely dared to breathe in his presence. Each phrase became more than warning. It became prophecy. Inside the house, there was no laughter, no games, no moments of warmth. There were only rituals. Mealtimes were stripped of joy, turned into lessons of restraint. Children were ordered to sit in silence, their bowls filled with tasteless porridge that clung to their throats. Sometimes he would bring out a single sweet apple, set it in the center of the table, and make them stare at it until the smell itself drove them restless. Then he would cut it into pieces, scatter ash over the flesh, and burn it until its sweetness turned to smoke. They were forced to inhale that smoke, to cough as he told them this was the smell of temptation being destroyed. Every ritual was designed not only to forbid but to remind them that desire would be met with cruelty. Behind closed doors, he refined these punishments with the precision of a scholar. He kept a small journal locked in his cabinet, filled with notes in his careful hand. Each entry recorded the weight of a child before and after a fast, the number of hours they spent kneeling in prayer, the count of lashes he had given for stolen crumbs. He measured guilt like others measured coin, ensuring that every sin was balanced with suffering. To him, cruelty was not chaos but discipline. He saw himself as both father and physician, diagnosing temptation and prescribing pain. The punishments grew stranger, more ritualistic with each passing month. When one child was caught licking honey from a spoon left behind by a guest, he made her stand barefoot on coarse salt for hours until the skin split and burned with every step she took afterward. When another boy was found chewing on dried fruit, he pressed his lips shut with iron clamps, forcing him to breathe only through his nose until he fainted. These were not the punishments of an angry man. They were the experiments of someone who believed suffering could cure the soul. The family began to see him less as a father and more as a priest of pain, a saint of restraint who worshipped his own twisted doctrine. Each death, each disappearance that followed was folded neatly into his rituals. The daughter who had tasted sugar was not treated as a tragedy but as proof. Her absence was woven into the family's daily prayers, her punishment retold as parable. The children were made to repeat her lesson, to whisper that corruption had been burned out of her, that she had been saved through agony. The more they recited, the more their minds bent under the weight of his belief. Fear became their language, silence their shield. Yet beneath his calm exterior, the patriarch was not free from torment. He believed he was chosen to guard purity, but he also feared discovery. When he looked at his children, he did not see faces but vessels, fragile jars that might crack at any moment. He obsessed over every twitch, every sigh, convinced it was evidence of hidden desire. He could not rest, for he believed corruption could grow unseen, like mold behind walls. This paranoia made his rituals harsher, his discipline sharper, as though he were fighting shadows only he could see. In the town, people still admired his restraint. They saw a man who avoided indulgence, who lived without vanity, who appeared untouched by weakness. He let them believe this, for their praise was another layer of his disguise. He was respected for the very discipline that cloaked his cruelty. The more the world admired him, the deeper he sank into the role of prophet. And the deeper he sank, the more his family paid the price. By now, the children no longer saw food as nourishment. They saw it as a test, every meal a ritual that might end in pain. Their bodies grew thin, their eyes sunken, yet they whispered prayers of gratitude, repeating the words he had burned into them. In their silence, he found proof of his success. To him, their suffering was not evil, but evidence of his victory over desire. And yet, even as the rituals grew, the fear inside the house grew heavier still. The memory of the daughter who had vanished lingered like a ghost, her fate unspoken but never forgotten. Each child wondered if they would be next, if their own hidden weakness would be uncovered, if their father's calm voice would one day call them to the table. And the patriarch, seated at the head with hands folded, already planned the lessons yet to come. The dining room was never meant to be a place of warmth. Yet in this house it became something far worse. The long oak table that once bore bread and stew now stood like an altar, stripped of comfort and made into a stage for punishment. At first, the children were forced to eat thin porridge without salt, meals that starved their tongues of any sensation, but the ritual soon deepened. The patriarch believed sweetness had to be buried in memory as well as body. He would take sugared fruits brought by neighbors or crumbs of candied bread and crush them into ash. Then he scattered the gray powder into the fire while his family stood in silence, breathing in the sickly perfume of sweetness turned to smoke. The children gagged as the scent burned their throats, and he told them this was the smell of sin dying, the scent of temptation devoured by flame. But the rituals did not end with smoke. He needed more, something that made fear permanent. So a new order was made. Each week, one child was bound upon the table as if offered to invisible judges. Ropes held their arms flat against the wood, their legs stretched so they could not kick. A basin of salted bread was placed before them, heavy loaves baked until hard as stone, each slice soaked in brine. The chosen child was forced to chew until their throat closed in revolt. Salt cut their mouth open, dried their lips, and drew water from their eyes until tears blurred their vision. The others were ordered to sit and watch, hands folded, mouths closed, unable to look away. The patriarch called this the purging of desire. He said the salt preserved the soul as it preserved meat, that the choking was proof of corruption leaving the body. The first time it happened, the boy chosen survived, coughing and gasping until his chest heaved raw. He was released, collapsed upon the floor, and dragged to bed with bleeding gums. The siblings whispered in the dark that night, too terrified to speak heresy, yet unable to banish the sound of his choking. But in the weeks that followed, the ritual repeated. Each child, one by one, was bound to the altar, the bread pressed against their lips until their mouths filled with brine. The father recorded every reaction in his hidden journal, writing notes about how long each resisted, how quickly tears fell, how often they vomited salt onto the floor. The ritual became the rhythm of their lives, the shadow over every meal. None of them could eat without imagining the table waiting, the ropes tightening, the salt burning their mouths. Hunger itself grew strange, no longer a cry of the stomach, but a wound of the mind. The children lost weight, their bodies thin, their eyes hollow. Yet he declared their weakness a sign of purity, proof that temptation was losing its hold. To him, each bone pressing against skin was a victory. It was inevitable that one would not survive. One winter evening, the eldest son was bound upon the table. His body was already frail, his lips cracked from nights of fasting, his chest weak with coughs. When the salted bread was forced between his teeth, he tried to chew, but his throat seized shut. His gasps grew louder, his skin turned pale, and foam bubbled at his lips. The siblings sat frozen, the room filled with the sound of his desperate wheezing. The father did not stop even when the boy's body convulsed. He only watched, eyes calm, waiting for proof that the soul could withstand. But when the boy went limp, when silence fell heavy as stone, the patriarch only bowed his head and whispered that the Lord had taken him whole. The corpse was carried from the room, never spoken of again. His death folded into silence like the vanished daughter before him. For the others, the table was now more than fear. It was certainty. They knew each turn might be their last, that the salted bread could end them as easily as it had their brother. And yet no one resisted, for resistance would only hasten the ritual. They walked through the house with lowered eyes, each breath a prayer that they might survive another week. The patriarch, meanwhile, saw none of this as cruelty. In his mind, he was a physician of the spirit, curing the sickness of desire through calculated discipline. His calmness, his absence of anger made it worse. Every act of torture was delivered not with rage, but with steady hands, as though guided by reason. He told himself the deaths were sacrifices demanded by heaven, that the house had been chosen as the furnace of purity. In this conviction, he grew stronger, more convinced, less human. The table remained where it was, polished clean after each ritual, the wood darkened by the salt and sweat of the children who had suffered upon it. It stood not only as furniture, but as monument, a silent promise of what would come next. The surviving children avoided its touch, yet they could not escape its presence. It became the axis of their lives, their terror and their prayer. And as the ash still clung to the chimney from burned sweets, the smell of bitterness haunted them all, binding their memories to the father's ritual. It was no longer just a home. It was a temple of cruelty, and the altar at its heart was always waiting. Temptation always finds its way into houses that pretend to be pure. Despite the patriarch's endless rituals, despite the suffocating weight of silence that bound the children into obedience, sweetness still crept in. A noble family visited one autumn, their servants carrying parcels wrapped in cloth, trays of sugared figs and candied nuts prepared for feasting. The children were made to stand aside, eyes lowered as the trays passed. They were told not to look, but the smell filled the air, clinging like incense. For one girl, the scent of honeyed fruit gnawed at her mind until it felt like her very body was betraying her. When a servant dropped a small lump of sugar upon the floor, quick and unnoticed, she reached for it. The grain sat heavy in her palm, brighter than any jewel, and before reason could stop her, it dissolved on her tongue. The sweetness burned in its innocence, a forbidden warmth that carried both joy and terror. She thought she had hidden her disobedience, but the patriarch's gaze was sharper than hunger. He watched her in the days after, watched the way her eyes drifted, the way her lips trembled when she swallowed plain broth. He saw guilt in the smallest twitch of her hands, and guilt to him was proof of sin. He let her suffer in silence first, allowed the guilt to rot inside her, waiting until it swelled too large to contain. Then, when the house was quiet, he summoned the family to the table. He spoke without anger, without raised voice, but with the gravity of a judge announcing a sentence. He said the house had been defiled, that temptation had entered through one of them, and that purity demanded sacrifice. His calm tone made the words heavier than any shout. The girl understood at once that her crime had been seen, even if no one else dared to speak it. The ritual that followed was unlike those before. The father had decided that punishment must not only silence disobedience, but erase the very memory of sweetness. He ordered sugar crystals brought forth from the noble's gift, declaring that sin must be carved out with the same weapon that birthed it. The girl was laid across the table, arms pinned beneath the weight of her brother's trembling hands. She stared up at the ceiling beams as her father pressed crystals into her gums, each grain like a shard of glass against her tender flesh. He forced them deeper, grinding them into the roots of her teeth until her mouth bled freely. She whimpered through the pain, but her cries were soft, muffled by the iron certainty of his hands. The sweetness dissolved into fire, burning her tongue, making her blood taste like syrup and iron. He demanded she chew. She tried, but every movement of her jaw tore the flesh further, mixing sharp pain with the bitter edge of sweetness. Her body shook with the effort, tears streaming down her cheeks as the family sat frozen. The mother wept quietly but did not interfere. The siblings stared in horror, knowing that any resistance would bring the same punishment upon them. The patriarch's eyes glowed with a calm satisfaction, as though he were a doctor watching a cure take hold. He whispered that she was being purified, that the body must bleed to cleanse the spirit. Her strength gave out quickly. Her throat swelled, her lips split, and blood poured down her chin, staining the table. When she tried to breathe, she choked on the mixture of blood and sugar, gagging until her body convulsed. Her father did not stop. He forced more crystals against her tongue, whispering prayers as if each word was another nail sealing her fate. Soon her cries turned to silence. Her chest moved weakly, then stilled. The room was filled only with the sound of the fire hissing, as if mocking the stillness of her body. The family did not bury her in the churchyard. There was no grave, no marker. Her body vanished into the earth beneath the cellar, hidden away like a secret sin. To the neighbors, she had been sent to serve distant kin. To the family, she had become a ghost no one dared to name. Her absence was folded into silence, yet her image haunted every sibling, each one seeing her pale face when they closed their eyes at night. For the patriarch, her death was not failure but triumph. He believed he had proven his doctrine, that temptation could be destroyed by force, that the sweetness of sin could be turned into fire. He returned to his journal that night, noting the time it had taken for her strength to collapse, writing that blood and sugar together carried the smell of purification. He ended the entry with the words, "The body resists, but the spirit obeys." The children lived on in terror. Every smile, every flicker of desire, every moment of hunger became dangerous. They knew the table would claim them too if they slipped, that their father's rituals left no room for weakness. The daughter who had slipped was gone, but her lesson remained. Her death had become another law carved into the house, another shadow upon the minds of those left behind. And in that silence, the father's conviction only deepened, preparing him for the cruelties yet to come. After the daughter who slipped was erased from their lives, the patriarch carried her memory not as grief, but as proof. In his twisted mind, her death confirmed what he had always believed, that desire for sweetness rooted itself in the mouth, in the very teeth that bit and chewed and longed for forbidden flavors. He turned then to the writings of physicians who had spoken of moral decay showing first in the gums, of sickness born from indulgence leaving traces in the tongue. To him it was revelation. If the mouth was the gateway to sin, then it must be broken, stripped of its weapons before it could betray again. What followed was not discipline in the ordinary sense. It was a campaign of mutilation carried out with the patience of a surgeon and the conviction of a prophet. The first extraction was done in silence. The chosen child, trembling, was ordered to sit upon the chair while the patriarch prepared his tools. He had no surgeon's hands, yet he believed he did heaven's work. He pressed iron against the boy's tooth and tore it free, ignoring the scream that echoed through the room. Blood poured from the wound, staining his shirt, but the father's face was calm. He held the tooth aloft like a relic, declaring it the root of corruption. The boy fainted from pain, his body slumped, but the tooth was set carefully into a glass jar. A date was marked upon a slip of parchment and placed inside beside it. This was the birth of the cabinet. It stood in the corner of the dining room, its glass panes polished, its shelves lined with rows of small jars. Each jar contained a tooth, sometimes cracked, sometimes whole, always with blood still clinging to the root. Beneath each jar was a label written in his hand, the child's name, the date of extraction, the offense that required it. He called it his record of purity, his insurance against desire. To the children it became a monument of terror. They could not eat without seeing their future reflected in the jars, could not sleep without dreaming of iron pressing against their gums. The ritual spread quickly, for once begun it could not be stopped. Each child was summoned in turn, their mouths pried open by the father's hands, their cries muffled by the mother's trembling grip. Some teeth came easily, slipping free with a snap, but others splintered, leaving fragments lodged deep within the flesh. Those moments lasted longest, the father digging with tools until screams turned hoarse and eyes rolled back. He told them the pain was cleansing, that each tear carried sin out of the body, but the wounds festered. Faces swelled, lips split, and fever took hold. One of the younger sons, too weak to recover, after losing 3 teeth in one night, slipped into silence by dawn. His body was buried beneath the floor while his teeth, neatly cleaned, were given their place in the cabinet. The deaths became part of the order. Resistance was punished more harshly, for defiance was, to the patriarch, the surest sign of hidden craving. One daughter clenched her jaw, refusing to open her mouth. He broke her teeth out one by one with a hammer, the sound like stones cracking in a fire. Her screams filled the house, then ceased as her body collapsed, her mouth pouring blood. She was silenced forever, yet her shattered teeth were gathered carefully, each fragment placed in jars as though her destruction were a triumph. The surviving children moved through the house with faces bruised and swollen, unable to chew, some barely able to speak. Their silence pleased him, for he believed the absence of speech meant the absence of temptation. The cabinet grew heavier with each passing month, its rows expanding until it seemed to gaze back at them all. Every meal became a ritual of fear. Every glance toward the glass a reminder that their mouths no longer belonged to them, but to the man who had remade their bodies in service to his doctrine. In his journal he wrote of the cabinet with pride, calling it his archive of victory, proof that his family had not surrendered to corruption. He marveled at the patterns of decay he believed he saw in the teeth, convinced each crack revealed a truth about the soul. To him, every jar was a confession, every gap in a child's mouth a monument to discipline. His calmness never faltered. He smiled even as his children wasted away, their eyes hollow, their lips trembling with fever, their voices lost to swollen gums. The cabinet stood taller than any grave, more enduring than memory. It was his altar, his trophy case, his masterpiece of restraint. And in its glass reflection, the children saw themselves already hollowed, already consumed, their futures lined up in jars that would outlive their bodies. They were no longer only his children, they were specimens. And the house had become not a home, but a chamber of dissection where innocence itself was pulled tooth by tooth, marked, catalogued, and displayed like a warning to any who might still dare to crave sweetness. In time, whispers of the family's restraint began to reach beyond the village. Neighbors told of their plain meals, their endless fasts, their children who never touched fruit or cake even when offered. To some, it seemed holy, to others enviable. Nobles intrigued by such displays of purity and clergymen who admired the doctrine of abstinence began to visit. They came expecting to see saints at a humble table, imagining that they were witnessing a household untouched by the corruption of indulgence. The patriarch welcomed them with calm politeness, his hands folded neatly as he guided them into the dining room. They mistook his stillness for godliness, never suspecting the cruelty beneath his smile. At first, the visits were harmless. Guests left speaking of the family's discipline, impressed by the silence of the children, their hollow faces lifted in prayer. But then some began to vanish. A noble who had arrived with servants was said to have departed suddenly in the night, though none had seen his carriage roll down the road. A priest who dined with them was never heard from again, his absence explained by rumors of reassignment. Each disappearance was covered with quiet words and forged letters, but the truth was far more grim. The patriarch had decided that strangers too must serve his rituals. He believed that temptation must not only be purged from his children but tested upon others, that even the powerful were not immune to corruption. The method he devised was cruel in ways only a mind like his could imagine. He began by offering honey, a substance his children were forbidden even to see. Guests, thinking themselves honored, dipped their fingers into the golden syrup and laughed at its sweetness. He pressed them to eat more, praising their joy as though it delighted him. But as their stomachs filled, he did not stop. He insisted they take more spoonfuls, each one heavier, until their laughter grew uneasy. Soon they gagged, their bodies revolting against the flood of sugar. Honey dripped down their chins as they vomited, their faces red with strain, but he only nodded as though watching sin burn itself out. When they were weakened, gasping for air, he brought forth the boiled sugar. Hardened into shards sharp as knives, it glittered like glass in the candlelight. He told them it was a delicacy, urging them to swallow. Some obeyed in confusion, their mouths already raw from sickness, their throats burning as the jagged edges tore at their flesh. Others resisted, but resistance only made the ritual harsher. He pried their mouths open, pressing the shards against their tongues until blood flowed. Each swallow carved wounds inside them, cutting the stomach, slicing the bowels. They screamed until their voices cracked, then fell silent as the bleeding hollowed them from within. The family was forced to watch. The children sat rigid as the guests writhed upon the floor, clutching their bellies, blood mixing with honey on the boards. To the patriarch, their suffering was sacred, a revelation that indulgence destroyed not just the spirit but the body. He declared these deaths to be divine demonstrations, proof that sweetness was not pleasure but poison. His wife wept quietly, her tears ignored as the rituals repeated, her silence proof of her submission. The children's eyes grew darker with each death, their young minds scarred by the sight of strangers choking beside the table where they themselves had once been bound. When the bodies finally stilled, they were carried to the cellar. The patriarch moved them with a steady, deliberate rhythm as though laying relics into a crypt. The corpses were hidden beneath dirt and stone. their belongings quietly sold, their names erased. To the outside world, letters arrived claiming they had traveled, or rumors were planted that they had fallen ill elsewhere. No one questioned too closely, for in that time sudden disappearance was not uncommon. But within the house, every silence left behind by a missing guest pressed heavier on the children, who knew the truth lay beneath their feet. The patriarch wrote about each victim in his journal, recording their names, their rank, the number of spoonfuls of honey consumed before vomiting began, the time it took for the sugar shards to silence them. His entries read like scientific trials, each one a study in pain, each one proof that his doctrine was correct. To him, he was not murdering but demonstrating, not cruel but chosen. The outside world saw only a pious man whose table never overflowed with sweets, whose home seemed ruled by prayer. But behind closed doors, he had turned hospitality into ritual slaughter. The pattern grew, steady and undeniable. Each new visitor brought another chance for testing, another lesson to be carved into flesh. And each disappearance deepened the silence of the house, binding the children tighter in their terror. For they knew that if their father could destroy nobles and priests without consequence, then none of them would ever be safe. The altar at the center of their lives was no longer meant only for them. It had become a trap for anyone who entered, a place where sweetness was turned into blood and where no guest ever returned whole. Beneath the quiet floors of the house, where neighbors believed only dry wood and grain were stored, there lay another world, one built from brick, sweat, and silence. The cellar was lined with stone walls darkened by moisture, the air forever carrying a strange mix of vinegar's sting and the heavy perfume of sweetness. It was not a storeroom. It was a chamber of trial, a place the patriarch called his laboratory of purity. To his mind, the table above had taught the flesh restraint. But here below, he would attack the breath itself. For if sweetness could corrupt the tongue, then surely it could rot the lungs as well. He prepared it carefully, methodically, with the precision of a man convinced he was serving a higher purpose. Iron kettles were arranged along the walls, filled with sugar and vinegar, then placed over coals until the mixture hissed and smoked. The air grew thick, the syrup turning into a sweet vapor that clung to the throat like a hand. He believed this was proof of sugar's poison, that its invisible touch revealed the body's revolt against corruption. And to test it, he sealed his victims within the chamber, locking the door from the outside, writing in his journal as their bodies fought for every breath. The first child chosen was no older than 10. Thin from fasting, lips cracked from salt, he was lowered into the chamber while his siblings stood upstairs, hearing only the scrape of iron and the father's calm instructions. Once the door was bolted, the vapor began to spread. At first the boy coughed, the sweetness coating his throat until he gagged. Then the choking deepened, each inhale dragging fire into his chest. His small fists pounded the door, his voice breaking into screams that no one outside would answer. The patriarch stood with pen in hand, timing each gasp, noting the intervals between cries. To him, this was data, the body revealing its secret rebellion. The boy's breath grew ragged, each inhale sharper, the lungs drowning in sweetness that should have been pleasure but had become suffocation. He fell to the floor, convulsing as vomit mixed with blood, the syrup thick in his nostrils. The patriarch recorded the exact moment his body stilled, writing that the lungs had rejected corruption entirely. He dragged the body out with cold precision, laid it against the cellar wall, and wrote another line in his journal: "Sin departs through the mouth." Purity proven by silence. The experiments did not stop there. One by one, the children were sent below, each subjected to the ritual of vapor. Some lasted longer, their bodies fighting to survive, their screams echoing in the stone until hoarse silence took them. Others succumbed quickly, their weak frames collapsing after only minutes. The patriarch grew obsessed with the differences, convinced they revealed truths about the depth of hidden desire. He measured pulse, color of lips, stiffness of limbs, writing each detail as though compiling a holy scripture of suffering. The cellar grew crowded with death. The air clung to the stone, the sweetness never fully leaving, making the place smell forever of decay disguised as honey. The children who survived long enough to return upstairs did so broken. Their eyes watered endlessly, their throats scarred raw. They moved like ghosts, unable to speak above whispers, too afraid to breathe deeply lest they remember the chamber waiting below. The terror of that place pressed upon them even when the door was closed, its presence living in their lungs like a shadow. The patriarch alone saw glory in it. He told himself that he had proven what others feared to admit. That temptation was not only in taste but in breath itself. That sweetness suffocated the soul. He wrote pages of triumph, comparing his discoveries to the words of great physicians, though none had ever imagined such cruelty. In his mind, he had outdone them all, transforming his cellar into a shrine of knowledge, his dead children into evidence of truth. He believed himself not a murderer, but a recorder of the body's revolt, a saint who gave meaning to suffering. The family upstairs could not speak of it. The cellar door became the most feared object in the house, every creak of its hinges enough to still their hearts. They learned to live without sound, to swallow their hunger, to silence their thoughts. For they knew that at any moment the Father's calm voice could summon them below, into the chamber where breath itself turned against them. Death there was not quick, not merciful, but drawn out in choking gasps, each moment logged by a steady hand that saw only purity in their pain. And so the house above remained deceptively quiet, the table polished, the prayers spoken, the neighbors nodding at its piety. But beneath their feet in the dark where air itself betrayed the body, the true heart of the home beat, methodical, patient, and merciless. The chamber below had become its own altar, one that demanded not food, not blood alone, but the very breath of those it consumed. And it was far from finished. By now, the house was no longer just a place of living. It had become a machine of ritual, a furnace of cruelty where the patriarch's doctrine shaped every breath, every movement, every death. The chamber below had proven to him that sweetness poisoned not only the tongue but the lungs. Yet he was not finished. His mind, restless in its obsession, turned next to the skin itself. If desire could enter through taste and breath, then surely it lived beneath the surface of the flesh. To purge it fully, he reasoned, the skin must bear the mark of discipline. He began with fire. In the cellar, the same kettles that once filled the air with choking vapor were now filled with sugar boiled until it bubbled, thick and dark, its surface snapping with heat. When poured, it hardened almost instantly into a clear glaze, brittle like glass. The patriarch believed this transformation was sacred, a symbol that sweetness, when touched by flame, revealed its true nature as pain. His victims were his children, chosen without warning, stripped of cloth and bound upright against the wall. He dipped ladles into the boiling syrup and let it fall upon bare flesh. The liquid clung as though alive, searing into skin with a hiss, hardening into a cruel crust that trapped the body beneath. The children learned not to scream. The first time it happened, the cries echoed through the house, raw and piercing. But the patriarch struck the sound from them with lash and gag. Silence soon became part of the ritual, demanded as proof of obedience. Tears ran down their faces, but their mouths remained closed, their agony sealed inside. When the syrup cooled, he peeled it away, tearing strips of skin with it. The flesh came free in ragged sheets, bright red beneath, the air heavy with the smell of burning sugar and blood. Each strip was placed into jars filled with brine and vinegar, preserved as though they were relics of faith. Upon every jar he wrote verses from Scripture, lines twisted to serve his doctrine, phrases about purity, fire, and sacrifice. The jars multiplied quickly. They lined the shelves beside the cabinet of teeth, a grotesque archive of his children's suffering. Where once he had cataloged bites of temptation, now he collected pieces of their bodies, convinced that he was recording the defeat of corruption. He wrote in his journal of the way the skin blistered, of how the syrup drew out the impurity within. His entries read like scientific studies, yet each word dripped with the hunger of a man who had forgotten what mercy meant. Some children did not survive the harvest. Their wounds festered, infection spreading until fever consumed them. Their bodies shook with chills, lips cracking as they whispered prayers for release. When they died, their remains were buried beneath the floor, but their jars remained above, marked and ordered as though they had simply passed into another form of service. The patriarch spoke of them as sacrifices, their flesh given willingly to protect the family. In truth, their silence was forced, their deaths methodical. Yet in his mind, their suffering was not cruelty, but evidence of triumph. The survivors carried the marks forever. Their bodies were scarred, their movements stiff, their eyes emptied of light. They no longer looked at one another, for to see the burns on their siblings was to remember their own. Their silence became more than fear. It became habit, the only way to endure a life where sound brought punishment. Even the mother ceased her weeping, her face hollow, her eyes following her husband's hands as though she no longer recognized them as human. The house itself smelled of sweetness now, not the joy of sugared cakes, but the cloying, rotten scent of syrup mixed with blood. It clung to the walls, to the bedding, to the hair of the children who lay sleepless through the night. The neighbors still admired the family's purity, unaware of the furnace beneath the quiet rooms, unaware that the sweetness they praised had been turned into a weapon. For the patriarch, the harvest of skin was not the end, but only another step. He believed he was moving closer to perfection, that each strip preserved in glass was a victory against temptation. He told himself that he was not destroying his family, but reshaping them, purging them of corruption, one tooth, one breath, one piece of flesh at a time. And as the jars filled, as the cabinet grew heavier, his conviction only deepened. To him, the silence of his children was not despair. It was proof that their bodies had finally learned to obey. The altar above, the chamber below, the cabinet of teeth, and now the jars of skin. They were no longer separate rituals, but parts of one great order, each connected, each feeding the next. The house was a temple to his doctrine, and every death, every scar was another stone laid in its foundation. And though the children no longer cried, though their silence thickened like ash in the air, the suffering did not end. For silence itself had become the language of their torment, and silence was exactly what the patriarch desired most. For years, the house had stood as a monument of quiet discipline, its windows shuttered, its doors opening only to select guests who rarely returned. The neighbors still spoke in admiration of its purity, but within its walls the children moved like shadows, their bodies scarred, their voices stolen by fear. Silence had been their law, but silence cannot last forever. It was the servants who broke it first. They had endured the smell of burned sugar clinging to the air, the muffled cries seeping through the floorboards, the endless jars filled with things no household should keep. Some fled in the night, their absence explained away by the patriarch as weakness of faith, but not all fled without speaking. A handful carried whispers to the village, strange rumors of punishments that went beyond prayer, of smoke rising from the cellar even on days without cooking, of children who vanished without farewell. At first, the whispers were dismissed as bitterness, the tales of servants resentful of strictness. But one story reached the ears of a physician in town, a man who had read of experiments whispered from older times. He remembered accounts from the courts of Elizabeth and James when alchemists and surgeons had mixed faith with cruelty, testing the body with poison and fire in search of divine truth. The physician recognized patterns in the rumors, the suffocation, the scalding, the broken mouths. He began to write letters in secret, sending them to colleagues in the city. His words were careful, never direct, but he described a household that used science as punishment, that turned sugar into a weapon, that claimed purity while hiding bones beneath its floor. He asked if such practices had been known before, and the replies he received were uneasy. Yes, they said there were whispers in history, but never so bold, never so close. It was enough to draw suspicion. Officials came quietly at first to observe, then to search. The patriarch welcomed them with the calmness of a man certain of his innocence. He offered them bread without salt, water without wine, speaking in low tones about restraint and godliness. Yet the officials moved through the house with eyes sharp, and in the cellar they found what no explanation could erase. Beneath the dirt were bones, fragile and small, some still carrying traces of hardened sugar that had crystallized around them. The smell of vinegar lingered in the air, and the jars lined neatly on the shelves bore verses scrawled across labels that hid nothing of their contents. Teeth gleamed in rows behind glass, and strips of preserved flesh floated in cloudy liquid, their labels speaking not of medicine but of sacrifice. The patriarch did not falter. As the bones were lifted from the ground, he declared that they were not corpses but relics, not proof of cruelty but evidence of salvation. He told the officials that the children and guests who had suffered beneath his hand had been purified, that their deaths were not murder but deliverance from temptation. His voice never rose, his hands never trembled. To him, the jars, the teeth, the bodies, these were scripture written not on paper but on flesh. He spoke with the certainty of a prophet, as though expecting the world to kneel before his logic. But the officials recoiled. What they saw was not purity but madness, not faith but an archive of torment. Their report spoke of a house turned into a tomb, of a family consumed by a doctrine that used sugar as both idol and weapon. They described the calmness of the patriarch not as holiness but as inhuman, the steady gaze of a man who could no longer tell the difference between salvation and cruelty. The neighbors, once so admiring, began to whisper new stories, that the family had dined on smoke and ash, that their children's laughter had been silenced by torture, that their home had hidden not saints, but monsters. The patriarch was taken away, yet even in chains he carried himself as though untouchable. He insisted that the world would never understand, that history would prove him right, that his rituals would be remembered as the path to purity. In his mind, the discoveries he had made in his cellar were revelations, not crimes. He smiled as though he had won, even as society turned its back on him in disgust. The silence that had ruled the house was broken at last, but it carried no relief. Instead, it spread outward like a plague, filling the village with unease, staining the region with shame. For what had been discovered could not be forgotten. The bones crystallized with sugar, the flesh preserved with scripture, the teeth labeled and stored. These became memories that no fire could burn away. The family's name, once spoken with admiration, was now muttered only with fear. And though the patriarch was gone, his rituals lived on in the minds of those who had seen the cellar, haunting them with the knowledge of how far faith, twisted by obsession, could fall into cruelty. When the house was finally condemned, the villagers gathered at a distance. No one dared step close, for even in its emptiness, the building carried the weight of something unholy. The air smelled of vinegar soaked into wood, and every window seemed to stare outward like the eyes of a corpse. Officials decided that fire was the only cleansing fit for such a place. Torches were carried in, flames caught upon the beams, and before long the house was swallowed whole. Yet even as the timbers cracked and the roof collapsed, those watching knew that burning wood could not erase what had been done within. Evil does not end in smoke. It lingers in memory, and memory does not burn. The ashes left behind were sifted with care. Among them were blackened fragments of glass jars, their labels half burned but still legible. Verses that spoke of purity beside what remained of flesh. Iron clamps, rusted red from the heat, lay twisted in the rubble. Fragments of teeth glimmered in the soot, white against black, silent witnesses to what the world had chosen not to see until it was too late. No names were carved for the dead, no graves dug in the churchyard. Instead, memorial stones were placed on the edge of the field, each etched only with a date, cold reminders of the moments when innocence was turned into ritual sacrifice. The anonymity was deliberate, for the shame of it was too great. Society preferred to mark time rather than name victims. In the years that followed, the story of the house spread quietly, shaping laws in whispers rather than proclamations. Officials, shaken by what they had seen, began to argue that children required protection not only from poverty and hunger, but from the hands of their own families. Early discussions of child welfare, still fragile in their infancy, gained weight from the memory of the jars and the cabinet. Words were written about food and purity, about how sugar itself could be dangerous when corrupted by greed or obsession. Laws on food adulteration were seeded in these fears, not only to guard against poison in the market, but to guard against the madness of those who would twist nourishment into torment. Yet even as these changes unfolded, society looked away from the deeper truth. It was easier to believe that this family had been an isolated horror, a rare sickness, rather than admit that the seeds of such cruelty lay within the very ideals they had praised. Restraint, purity, discipline. These words had been admired in sermons, yet within the house they had been sharpened into weapons. What had been celebrated as virtue outside had become methodical violence inside. And no law, however well written, could erase the knowledge that evil had hidden in plain sight, cloaked in innocence, speaking in the calm voice of a father who claimed to love his children. For those who had witnessed the cellar and the cabinet, the memory never faded. They dreamed of the bones crystallized with sugar, of the smell of burning syrup clinging to stone, of children bound in silence while their own flesh was peeled away. They could not unsee how order had been used as cover for cruelty, how ritual had disguised murder as salvation. Some drank heavily to forget, others buried themselves in their work. A few spoke in hushed voices, warning that what had happened there could happen again, for as long as society allowed silence to shield those who claimed virtue as their excuse. And so the legacy of the house was not only in laws or memorial stones, it was in the unspoken fear that evil rarely shouts. It does not always come with rage or chaos. More often it wears the mask of restraint, the face of calm piety, the soft voice of one who insists he is protecting you while he tightens the rope. It thrives in silence, feeding on obedience until one act of disobedience pulls the mask away and shows what lies beneath. By then it is often too late, the ashes scattered in the wind, but the lesson remained. Evil had lived in that house, not as fury but as patience, not as chaos but as method. It had hidden behind purity until discovery forced the world to see. And even now, centuries later, the question lingers in every heart that hears the tale. Could such rituals still exist behind closed doors, unnoticed, unspoken, waiting for the silence of others to protect them?